Hi, everybody. Welcome in. We would love to hear where you are joining from as we get started today. We'd love to hear how the weather is in your area as well. It's the first day of spring.
And down under with Jillian. Is it first day of fall then, probably, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So we've got some North Carolinians, of course, Greenville, South Carolina. Elaine from Montreal, welcome. Winnipeg. Hopefully springtime is around the corner for Canadians.
And Elaine. Hi, Elaine.
Yeah.
Brenda from Atlanta.
Yeah.
Welcome in, everybody. California.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Cloudy New York City. Oh, there's Jillian.
Yeah.
Hey, yeah, our past speaker. Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So first, welcome spring. We're very happy to see that. So hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Deb Barnum. I'm joined tonight by my fellow co-hosts, Inga Brody and Eric Bontempo. Our technical director for this episode is Nadea Pugh, senior, soon to be graduating from UNC Chapel Hill. We have been so thankful to have Nadea as our technical director for the past 3 series. And going all the way back to 2019, the Jane Austen and Company has aimed to provide top-notch programming related to Jane Austen.
So tonight, we continue our new series on music in the Regency. This is our 3rd episode out of 4 for this spring. 2 weeks ago, Gillian Dooley discussed music in Austen's life and work, including some of what she would have played and sang. And back in February, we kicked things off with Jeff Nigro's talk on Georgian fangirls and the influence that Italian castrati would have had on Regency music in England. All of our presentations this series strive to provide widely different perspectives on the subject of music and the Regency. Music making and music appreciation could be complicated, even contested activities in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So we're trying to look at all aspects of public music and domestic music, and sometimes zero in on Jane Austen's own musical experience. Each presentation in this series, we aim to include a musical delight. And tonight, Kathryn Libin moves our series outward to women and musical education during this period. And finally, on April 10th, Laura Klein will kind of wind down our spring series by discussing the evolution of keyboard music during this period and consider the music that Austen was practicing when she was writing her novels.
And please visit our website to get more information on this lovely slate of speakers for this series and to watch the recordings from all the previous ones and all our previous series too. There are many, many recordings online that are free for your enjoyment. Our website is janeaustenandco.org, and Nadea has a banner for us on that. In addition, I wanted to take a couple minutes to advertise the 2025 Jane Austen Summer Program. As I'm sure you know, that this year we are celebrating the 250th birthday of Jane Austen, so there are lots and lots of birthday bashes around the world. And our JASP event is celebrating the occasion with a special version of our summer program, taking place this time in New Bern, North Carolina on the coast. With a theme of sensibility and domesticity, and in a transatlantic context. So during our 4-day symposium, we will be exploring topics like medicine and birth and domestic arts, both in Regency England and in the colonial US. We'll focus on Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, considering the birth of her career as a published writer, as well as taking a transatlantic look at the world into which she was born. The other website for this is www.janeaustensummer.org, and that has information about registering, travel, accommodation, and you name it. We host in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Carrboro, North Carolina, but we have a grant from the NC Humanities, and because of that, we're taking JASP on the road for this special celebratory summer. And New Bern is the home of Tryon Palace, where North Carolina's first governor had his mansion. It also has that great Outlander Scottish connection, piratical considerations to be had. We'll celebrate all those things, and the relevance of the Navy, pirates, and the sea to Austen's novels.
So now I'm very excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Kathryn L. Libin, Mary Conover Mellon Professor of Music at Vassar College. Earned BM and MA degrees in piano performance at the Oberlin Conservatory at New York University, and a PhD in musicology at NYU. She has lectured and published on Mozart's music and manuscripts, on music in Jane Austen's life and works, and on musical sources in the Lobkowicz Library near Prague. Her articles on Jane Austen and music may be read in Persuasions, volumes 19, 22, 28, and 46. If you want to put that in the chat, Nadea.
Mm-hmm.
Persuasions 19, 22, 28, and 46. And then in the collection, Elegance, Propriety, Harmony, Jane Austen and the Arts from 2013. And in the Edinburgh Companion to Jane Austen and the Arts from 2024. At Vassar, she teaches a course on Jane Austen and music in the domestic sphere.
And before Kathryn begins her talk tonight, our technical director, Nadea, will explain how you can send in questions during and after this event.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, we ask that you please use the comment feature on the sidebar. We'll collect your comments throughout the presentation, and then during the Q&A after the presentation, Kathryn can answer them. So please, please, please get those questions and comments in. Our speakers really do love to hear from you all. You will need to log into your Google or YouTube account to post using that comment feature. But if you don't have a YouTube or Google account, that's okay. And you can just submit your questions to info@janeaustenandco.org. We'll collect questions there as well and ask those for you in the chat. And I'll post that email on the screen in a few seconds, so you can all see in messages there, if that's easier.
All right, and now without further ado, we present Kathryn Libin and her presentation on women and musical education in the Regency era.
Thank you very much. You could go ahead and put the first slide up, the title slide. There we go. I would like actually to begin by thanking Jane Austen and Co., the organizers of this really wonderful series, and especially Nadea and Eric for all of their help, and Susan Ford for her kind invitation to participate in this. And I'll just say that I'm streaming this evening from the Dickinson Music Library at Vassar College, which was founded to educate women. So I thought that this was a good setting for our discussion this evening. Now, I would like to begin by spending a little time contemplating this fascinating document, which is actually a trade card or a kind of form of advertisement for a music school, a boarding school that featured music and all kinds of other subjects during this period. And it's a fascinating little display. And for that reason, there are things that we can definitely unpack from this. One of the things that we know is that music was a vital component of the classical 7 liberal arts, rooted in ancient Greek theories about how to educate a strong citizen. So the idea was to begin with a curriculum of rhetoric, logic, and grammar. This would become known as the trivium. And then you would continue with the study of geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. This was known as the quadrivium. So this little trade card clearly evokes classicist thinking, and it offers us a glimpse into which aspects of the classical liberal arts model survived in late 18th century education for women. So the first thing that we want to take note of is the figure of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, intellect, and the arts, who we see at the right, escorting a young girl into the circle of learning. At the center in the background, we see a beehive symbolizing industry and community, and it's flanked on either side by books of English, French, and Italian grammar, and a book marked Thomson on the spine, perhaps The Seasons, which was very famous in the period. So there's at least one aspect of our trivium there in the grammar. Then one of the items that Mrs. Chassaing advertises for her boarding school is geography, and we find that represented in the front by compasses and a map, and there's even a globe there, although actually it's not the kind of globe that would be used for studying geography. It's an armillary sphere for studying celestial latitude and longitude. So that's kind of interesting and goes with another aspect of the picture. In the background, we see a girl with a drawing pad, and she's sketching away at a sculptured bust that's there. And then we get to the two really important subjects, which are at right and left in the foreground. And on the right, next to Athena, music is represented by a keyboard instrument. And there's a large volume of music on the desk, and there's another large volume of music on the floor in the foreground. At the left, and this is really quite interesting because this is not mentioned on the list of things that one might study here, but it's very prominent in the picture, and that is astronomy, the other element in the ancient quadrivium that was most closely linked with music. We see a girl with a telescope on a tripod and a copy of James Ferguson's book on astronomy open in front of her. Now, that book on astronomy was published in 1756 and reprinted many, many times. It was used by all kinds of amateurs interested in astronomy because he says right on his title page, "Astronomy explained by Sir Isaac Newton's principles and made easy for those who have not studied mathematics." This made it perfect for a women's school. Because, of course, although women would be studying a certain amount of arithmetic to be able to do household accounts, the higher mathematics were not usually part of their training. So Ferguson's astronomy was perfect. Now, I've looked at many, many manuals of women's education, and they specifically point to astronomy as a suitable scientific pursuit. The link between astronomy and music goes back to the quadrivium and this long-standing belief in a harmony of the spheres. But why was it considered a specially appropriate study for women? And I want to just read a little passage for you from the Reverend John Bennet, who wrote one of the many conduct books of this period. And this was in the form of letters to a young lady on useful subjects. And after he first encourages young ladies to study botany, which, as I'm sure most of you know, was a very popular thing to engage in, he says this: "When you have viewed the wonders of nature in miniature, astronomy will show them in the sublime. Telescopes will present you with a most stupendous view of the heavens, suns piled on suns, worlds on worlds, and the great Creator presiding over all in the majesty of perfection. You will be lost and absorbed in the magnificent contemplation." Now here, I can't help but think about Fanny Price, who, as you'll recall in Mansfield Park, when given a choice of going into the drawing room to sing glees around the piano with her family, or stepping outside to admire a beautiful starry sky, chooses the more sublime of the two possibilities. And it's clear that astronomy had a certain moral component in the minds of educators. And so astronomy and music continued to be linked together in education even as late as the Regency era. Now, if you go to the next slide, we have this same trade card shown yet again, and also another advertisement from the same French and English school, as Mrs. Chassin calls it here. And here we also have a price list, which itemizes the different kinds of studies that can be purchased at the school. And the price list shows that the subjects of drawing, dancing, and music were the most costly for pupils. They're the only studies where they had to really hire special masters from outside, and all of those were over £1 per quarter. Now, this sort of school catered to a particular type of young lady, well-to-do and genteel. And in fact, there on her advertisement, it says, this is only for genteel ladies. In the Regency era, there were many, often very subtle gradations of class and of financial means, so there were varying options for musical education as well. Jane Austen herself, we know, attended a school as a girl where she would most certainly have had some music lessons. And later we know that she studied with a local church organist, Mr. George Chard, who rode from Winchester to Steventon to give her lessons. Her sister-in-law, Elizabeth Bridges, who is another musical member of the family, came from a wealthier background. So there's evidence in the family music books that suggests she likely had singing as well as keyboard lessons. Cousin Eliza Hancock, later Eliza de Feuillide and Eliza Austen, was even wealthier, and we know that she grew up with a top quality harpsichord in her home and later played the piano and the harp. Likewise, Austen's characters demonstrate a similar range of social standing, and her musical characters would have had training and instruments that comported with their positions. Next slide, please. So this Broadwood square piano was the most ubiquitous kind of instrument in middle-class households. So this was really a fundamental tool for the training of women musicians. We know that Broadwood was known to Austen and her family. The Broadwood account books show rentals of pianos by Edward Austen Knight at Chawton House. And in 1813, he spent nearly £40 on a high-quality square piano. And this was during the period that Austen was working on Emma, and actually mentions Broadwood as the piano in Emma that is mysteriously appears in Jane Fairfax's living room. Jane Austen herself bought a piano on moving to Chawton in 1809. She may possibly have spent around £30 for it. We don't know what type or what maker, but this is definitely the kind that it would have been. Next slide. Broadwood also made instruments of a more elevated type. This grand piano was the kind sought after by people with more wealth, with higher social standing, and with more space, frankly. This is also the kind of instrument that was increasingly used for professional performance. Next slide. I want to also mention the harp. It's an important instrument for women's education in this period. Harps were mostly of French manufacture. They were more expensive. We really need to consider them luxury items. Erard opened a business in London in 1792 during the French Revolution, and a fine harp could cost about £75, which was nearly twice as much as a good piano. So obviously, the learning of this instrument would be restricted to a particular kind of lady. Next slide, please. Here's another trade card. Miss Emily Cressy Dietrichson produced this for her business. And as you can see On moderate terms, the harp, pianoforte, and singing. That very much sums it up. One of the foremost education writers of the period, Elizabeth Appleton, states unequivocally in her treatise that training women in music involved either piano, harp, or singing. Women were extremely restricted in what they could choose to play because there was a strong emphasis on physical decorum and graceful, uncontorted, unrevealing gestures and postures. They did not play wind instruments and very few string instruments. The harp was one of the few stringed instruments that they could play. And of course, it was very like the piano in certain ways, so that made it a better option. So if I were to do a quick review of Austen's characters and the instruments that they play, we find quite a lot of pianists, beginning with Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. In Pride and Prejudice, we have a lot of music scenes going on. So we have both Elizabeth and Mary Bennet, as well as Miss Bingley. And then Miss Georgiana Darcy also plays piano. In Mansfield Park, we have Miss Bertram. This is probably the least musical of all of the novels, well, along with Northanger Abbey, of course. In Emma, we have Emma Woodhouse, Jane Fairfax, and Mrs. Weston, who all play. And Anne Elliot plays dance music in Persuasion. So those are all pianists. In terms of the harp, we have many fewer because of the kind of social status that it represented. So Miss Georgiana Darcy has a harp as well as a piano. Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park, of course, plays the harp. In Sanditon, Miss Beaufort is a harpist. And in Persuasion, the Mrs. Musgrove play the harp. And I'll add that almost everyone who plays an instrument also sings. We don't really hear of Anne Elliot doing any singing, but all of the others pretty much do. Now, in all of the music making that takes place in the novels, no music master is ever introduced. This is not something that apparently Austen wanted to get into. This is kind of the background nitty-gritty. So we need to ask, with whom did these characters study music? How did they get to the point in musical accomplishment that they achieved, all these different levels? We know from Elizabeth Bennet's comments to Lady Catherine de Bourgh that she and her sisters never had a governess. So the music teacher for her and Mary was probably a local organist, I would speculate. Emma Woodhouse, we know, had a governess, Mrs. Weston, who was a capital country dance player, according to Mr. Knightley. So she must have been Emma's teacher. One suspects that both Marianne Dashwood and Anne Elliot may have had a governess in their earlier years. It sounds from the evidence of the novels that both Jane Fairfax and Georgiana Darcy had rather superior music masters, and Mary Crawford would certainly have had a specialist with whom she studied harp. Now, the question is, what and how did young women actually learn music? Next slide, please. Now, if you were to look up Caroline Herschel, or as she became known in England, Caroline Herschel, you will find that she was an astronomer and considered to be the first professional woman scientist. In fact, this portrait was painted the year after she received the prestigious gold medal of the Royal Astronomical Society in 1828. But her first pursuit was music. She was born in Hanover, Germany in 1750, where her father was an oboist in a military band. And her older brother, William Herschel, already lived in England from a very early age in the fashionable town of Bath. He was a composer, an organist, the choir master at the Octagon Chapel, and the organizer of many public concerts at the Assembly Rooms and elsewhere. And Carolina joined him there in 1772. Now, she took lessons in harpsichord and piano. She studied singing, and she performed with William as conductor in his oratorio concerts. But as he grew more interested in astronomy, and this was a real change of direction for him. We know, for example, that he studied Ferguson's astronomy because he didn't have a mathematics background as a musician. He began to build his own telescopes, and she joined him as an assistant, ground lenses for him, and recorded observations. After he discovered a new planet, that would be Uranus, in 1781, the king appointed him court astronomer, and he rose in his profession. And Carolina spent countless nights scouring the skies with their telescopes, cataloging the stars, and making her own discoveries, including 8 comets. So both of them left music for astronomy. But I think it's not a coincidence that these two disciplines were part of their lives. Next slide, please. This shows the residence of the Herschels in Bath, which is now the Herschel Museum of Astronomy, well worth a visit. If any of you who know Bath have not yet been there. And I include this picture of the museum's music room because it looks so much like the trade card at the beginning, with all of the elements of both music and astronomy brought together in one little scene. Now, the reason that I bring her up, next slide. She left behind a good-sized music book, which gives us a step-by-step approach to how a young woman in the 1770s learned music. And this, we know, is a form of training that continued up really largely to the present day. A lot of the same kinds of approaches are used. So we see this page beginning with the basic major and minor chords in all of the main keys. And at the bottom, a really wonderful, very rigorously plotted circle of fifths, which of course shows the various major and minor keys in relation to one another and how many sharps and flats they each have. And when you actually handle this manuscript, one of the things that you see right off is her use of a compass, this minute little pinprick in the paper at the center where she centered her compass and then very, very carefully drew out the double circle for major and minor keys. And I think she's already showing her scientific bent even at this stage. Next page, please. Here we find the major scales with their clefs and key signatures, just as everyone would always study. You would begin by writing them out as well as playing them so that you got to know them very well. And one of the things that you'll see here are a few numbers thrown in here and there. These are the fingerings. Fingerings in the Regency era were different from what we are used to. The thumb was always given its own symbol, in this case, an X. And then the fingers were numbered with 1 being the pointing finger and the pinky being number 4. So whenever you see the number 4, that means you're starting at the very outer side of each hand. So this is still a kind of classic way to get to know the keyboard as well as all of the scales. Next slide. Here's a page with all of the different meters, and she writes out a short description of each one and the particular time signatures that represent them and how many beats we find to each bar. This is also absolutely essential at the very beginnings of your musical education. Next slide, please. Here we get drawn a little bit more into the aesthetics of music. She's given a nice list here of words of expression that one finds in music. So we have all of the standard things like cantabile and allegro and all of the different variations of emotional content that were becoming increasingly elaborate during this period. And next slide. And then Caroline, of course, was also taking singing lessons as well as studying the keyboard. And so she has a lot of very typical exercises at the time that were meant to, as she says, improve the tone of the voice, but also to improve flexibility. And one of the things that I wanted to note at the bottom there, in relation to Jeffrey Nigro's talk about the castrati, she shows how to perform a messa di voce, and this was a technique that was popularized by the castrati in England, a kind of swelling and then falling off of the voice, highly expressive. And it was the castrati who became the great vocal teachers of this period when they were retired and no longer on the stage. They taught voice lessons, and so messa di voce became really an important tool for many more singers than those on the operatic stage. Next slide, please. In Austen's time, we have students who are not only learning privately and writing down their lessons in the fashion that Herschel did, but more and more it was becoming very popular to simply buy an instruction book that would have all of this already written out for you. And I bring out this one by Johann Baptist Cramer, or John Cramer, as he was sometimes known in London, partly because he was one of the most famous of keyboardists and musicians of the period, but also because he's mentioned in Emma as among the musicians whose music was gifted to Jane Fairfax. He was born in Mannheim, but grew up in London, so he really was an Englishman. He studied with Clementi, and he became a professional touring virtuoso and performed in all of the major European capitals. And like his teacher Clementi, he also got into music publishing, and he also became a renowned pedagogue. And he not only published collections of etudes that were widely used, but he also published this very influential instruction manual. Next slide, please. And this shows a couple of pages from inside. One is this really very nice engraving of a dutiful pupil at her instrument with her manual open in front of her. And then another essential aspect of the training, after you had learned the scales and the rhythms and so forth, Cramer would provide the student with these tiny little preludes, basically to kind of warm up the fingers and get the sound of the key in the ear. And then he would launch them through this series of exercises in which each one got slightly more complicated in terms of rhythmic divisions and the kind of agility that you would need to play. And he gives a lot of extra information at the bottom about the kinds of notation that you see there, what slurs mean and things like that. Now, there are several works by Cramer in the Austen family music books, including a sonata based on God Save the King. And one assumes that Frank Churchill's gift to Jane Fairfax was likely a Cramer sonata or variations or some other work for solo piano, probably not the instruction book, but perhaps also one of the early collections of etudes, which were meant to be challenging. Next slide, please. So the beginning repertoire for young students who were just beginning to play, we had quite a lot of possibilities. Clementi wrote sonatinas for beginners, and Ignaz Pleyel wrote sonatinas for beginners. And this is a volume of them that is included amongst the Austen family music books. So I thought that we would hear a brief example of the first movement. Those of you who read music, this is the top couple of systems on the right, just so that we can hear what it sounds like. Okay, so you can hear that it's not particularly hard, but it's nonetheless a complete piece and something that a young pianist could learn and feel proud to play for their family or friends. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I got curious about not too long ago when thinking about Mary Bennet was the idea of thoroughbass and the role that it might play in a woman's musical education. It's mentioned in Pride and Prejudice that she was quite absorbed at a certain point in the study of thoroughbass. So I thought, okay, what was that about? Thoroughbass actually was a very specialized realm of 18th century keyboard performance because it introduced a level of improvisational skill into the playing. There were a lot of thoroughbass manuals that were available in the 1790s. So the Bennets might have had an older treatise, such as this one by Niccolo Pasquale, which was published in 1763, or Mary's teacher might have lent her a newer one. And the idea behind it was that you read from a bass line, and there were figures underneath the bass that indicated which intervals should be heard above it. And the performer would improvise a chordal accompaniment for voice or for other instruments. Normally, this was called continuo playing. And the practice of playing continuo was cultivated especially by professional keyboardists who performed with ensembles. And since it stands on the threshold of composition as well as professionalism, it's a skill that very few women learned. Next page, please. So this is an example of the opening of this little treatise in which it talks about why to study thoroughbass and what's involved. And it starts off with some very, very basic training in sort of how to shape the chords that you're going to need above each of the bass notes, even before you get into improvising over figures. You had to figure out really how to move from one chord to the next, and to do so by not breaking any contrapuntal rules. So that's really where this starts. This is not something that most women got trained in. Next page, please. Now this is another thoroughbass manual, and it gets a bit more specific on its title page about who it's intended for. Most of the manuals that discuss music as a component of women's education, even if they talk about music theory, they don't mention thoroughbass, not even mention. But treatises that are aimed at young men, and one example might be Daniel Fenning's Young Man's Book of Knowledge, they underline the importance of thoroughbass. Thoroughbass was considered to be intellectually challenging, a science as well as an art. And on the title page of Heck's thoroughbass manual, he says specifically that this study was meant for studious musicians and designed for the use of such young composers and performers in general as are desirous of being well-grounded in the science of harmony. So that, in its wording, is making this a bit exclusive, and exclusive mainly to men. Next page. Now, to go back to Carolina Herschel, she has notes on thoroughbass in her music book. And it reminds us that she worked as a professional musician before she became a scientist. And her music book shows that she also studied thoroughbass, recording not only the figures and what chords they implied, but also listing the rules and refinements of what she calls coherent accompaniment. And it's very interesting to see the kinds of things that she and her teacher thought were important that the player of thoroughbass ought to be able to do when accompanying another musician or a singer. So that's a kind of interesting bit of evidence that occasionally a woman did break through and study thoroughbass. So Mary Bennet perhaps was not entirely alone in her pursuit. Next slide, please. Now, another thing that we hear in the novels is that a couple of the characters actually play concertos. Now, at this point, we're moving out of the really beginning level represented by the Pleyel sonatina and getting into something more challenging. Both Mary Bennet and Marianne Dashwood play concertos for neighbors and friends. Now, a concerto like thoroughbass takes us into the public sphere of the professional. Concertos by the end of the 18th century were often vehicles for the virtuoso, full of dazzling passage work and all kinds of novel effects. In public concerts, they were played by a soloist with an orchestra, with the virtuoso typically playing along, improvising a continuo part during the orchestral sections, and then emerging to shine alone or in dialogue with other instruments in the ensemble. The title page on this concerto from the Austen Music Collection by the celebrated virtuoso Daniel Steibelt states that he performed it at the Opera Concert, which was one of the leading professional concert institutions in London. We know that he did so in 1798, shortly before the publication of the concerto. This work became quite popular, in part because of the sentimental slow movement on a Scottish air, but also because of its colorful rondo, which depicts a raging storm. The edition of the concerto in the Austen collection has been arranged, next slide please, so that a single pianist can play the entire work. So it doesn't have a separate part for keyboard and a separate score for the orchestra. It's all been arranged in one, with the orchestral part reduced so that the keyboardist can play it. So a pianist who is good enough, like Marianne Dashwood, could play a concerto entirely alone without the orchestra. So apparently both Marianne and Mary Bennet were up to the task. So I thought that we might hear a bit of this adagio based on the Scottish air, because this was very popular. You could actually stop it there. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so this is the rondo, the third movement. Interestingly, he calls it a rondo pastoral. And this is the movement that became famous because it evokes a storm sort of as a climactic point in the middle of the movement. And this is well before Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, so it's really kind of interesting. I'd like you to hear just a little bit of the opening of this so that you can get a taste for what a faster movement would have been like. Go ahead. Thanks. All right, so in this one, you can hear that there's a bit of dazzling figuration unleashed, and this would have required good training to be able to pull off well, and steady nerves. And clearly, Marianne and Mary felt that they could do this, so that's really, really interesting to know. Next slide, please. So songs, of course, were an important part of a young lady's education at the piano, or the harp for that matter. And there are lots of songs and lots of song singing in the Austen novels, many songs in the family music books, which Gillian Dooley spoke about earlier in this series. One finds songs of every type imaginable and for all different purposes. There are nursery rhymes set to music, there are sentimental French romances, there are Italian arias, excerpts from Handel's oratorios. It's really a marvelous potpourri. And a lot of Scottish and Irish tunes, such as those mentioned in Pride and Prejudice and Emma. Next slide. So every musical household contained sheafs and volumes of songs. The Austen family was no exception, and their collection contains a substantial selection of Scottish songs of the kind that not only Mary Bennet, but also Elizabeth, Miss Bingley, Mrs. Hurst, and Georgiana Darcy would sing. Songs like this really cut across all social boundaries in this period. And a lot of them were popular not only for singing, but also as dance tunes. Some editions provide possibilities for a duet with 2 lines for singers over the bass line, or perhaps substituting instruments such as a violin and a flute, which a gentleman might play. Next slide, please. This is just a little example of a couple of Scottish songs from this collection. And one of the things that you'll see on the page at right, there's a very rudimentary figured bass. If you can see beneath the system, there are numbers. You see an occasional 6, an occasional 6/5. This is a really easy kind of figured bass. So someone like Mary, who had studied a bit of thoroughbass, would be able to use those figures to fill out a little bit more accompaniment than is actually here. So that definitely would have been one reason to try to study thoroughbass if you possibly could, to be able to, you can certainly play one of these just with the right hand and left hand playing single lines, but the ability to add a few chords to it was actually very nice. Next slide, please. I thought I would turn briefly to the harp, and I include this lovely portrait of a harpist. There are lots of great portraits of harpists from this period, partly because it shows how very luxurious both harp and harpist are, but also because if you look closely, she is holding a tuning key in her right hand. And this is an aspect of women's education which I find very interesting. If you were a young lady playing the piano, there was no question of you ever opening your instrument and daring to actually tune it. There was always someone who was going to come to the house and tune it for you. But if you played the harp, you were far more likely to learn how to tune it yourself. And you had it there in your lap, close to your ear, and you were very aware every moment of whether it was in tune or not, and you needed to be able to make sure that it was. So I find that to be really a quite suggestive indication of the extra kinds of training that a harpist had to go through. Next slide, please. One of the foremost harpists of the period was Jean-Baptiste Krumpholz. That was not his given name. He was actually Czech and was born in central Bohemia, part of the Habsburg Empire. And being in the Habsburg realm, he gravitated to Vienna, where he studied and made his debut as a harpist, and then he toured Europe. And he worked very closely with harp manufacturers. This was a period of many technological innovations in both harp and piano. And he also became a noted harp pedagogue. And this manual is one of the ways that many young harpists, young women, studied harp at an early age. And it's set up very much in the same way that Cramer's instruction manual for piano is, similar kinds of exercises. Krumpholz also wrote a lot of repertoire for harp, which did not yet have much of a repertoire. He really helped to create it. Next slide, please. This is one of the things that French harp manufacturers did to promote their profession. In part, they produced music for it, as well as the instruments themselves. And there was more than one French harp journal during this period. They were all delivered to subscribers on a regular weekly basis, even into the years of the Revolution. This is a copy of the Feuilles de Terpsichore that was preserved in the Austen family collection. It no doubt belonged to Eliza de Feuillide. And if we look at the next slide, please. Yeah, this is just an example of the kinds of thing that we find inside. This is the favorite air of Austen's, as reported by her niece, Que j'aime avoir les hirondelles. We had the treat of hearing Gillian sing it on the last, hello? We're not ready for Hannah More yet, thank you. We got to hear Gillian sing this last time. Now let's have Hannah More. I think it's important to talk a little bit about what important educators of the period thought about the role of music in women's education, because there was not a single mind about the role that it ought to play. Some of the harshest views on music, and particularly musical accomplishment, come from the educator, abolitionist, playwright, and moralist Hannah More. And she wrote a very influential treatise, Strictures on the Modern System of Female Education, which addresses the topic of musical accomplishment quite vigorously. This is something that Austen probably would have been familiar with, because there was a copy in the library at Godmersham Park during her lifetime. After a long teaching career, More had come to feel that the pursuit of accomplishments was best suited to women who could afford it and could actively impede the progress and the duties of women in the lower classes. And she writes, "The use of the pencil, the performance of exquisite but unnecessary works, the study of foreign languages and of music require a degree of leisure which belongs exclusively to affluence." And she makes an exception only for women whom she says have great natural genius. So we could expect that someone like Jane Fairfax poor as she was, would be excused and allowed to advance her musical studies. But in general, that was not the case in Moore's thinking. Next slide, please. On the other hand, Maria Edgeworth and her father, Richard Lovell Edgeworth, offer a lot more balance in their critique than Hannah More's. They try to explore the true worth of musical training for young women and its value as an innocent pleasure, not only to enhance a woman's social status or to secure her a good marriage. They don't really believe that it has much of an impact on a woman's marriageability. And one of the things that they say that I think is very significant is this, and I'm quoting, "Women are peculiarly restrained in their situation and in their employments by the customs of society. To diminish the number of these employments, therefore, would be cruel. Every sedentary occupation must be valuable to those who are to lead sedentary lives. And every art, however trifling in itself, which tends to enliven and embellish domestic life, must be advantageous, not only to the female sex, but to society in general." Next slide. I can't resist bringing in James Fordyce. You'll recall that not long after the Reverend Mr. Collins introduces himself to the Bennet family, he ventures to read to them from Fordyce's sermons, but gives it up when Lydia talks over him. The Reverend James Fordyce had a great deal to say about accomplishments, and they were influential because this was a much published book, many, many editions. His thorough approval of dancing and music seems to have exerted a discernible influence on Austen's creation of Mr. Collins. However, he treats the accomplishment of music with some caution and suggests that young women should be careful about performing outside their own families if they're not very talented. And he brings the word genius into it, as Moore did, and certainly could have been addressing Mary Bennet in his remarks. Next slide, please. Elizabeth Appleton, whom I mentioned earlier, was an educator for whom music was very important. Both her father and brothers had been professional musicians. She had a French governess and spent a significant time in France and traveling on the continent, so she was a rather worldly lady who became a governess in an earl's family when she was quite young. She founded a school in London and did quite well financially. And since music was very central to her curriculum, she spends a lot of time with long, detailed remarks on music and instructions for music, which were clearly designed for governesses who were going to be designing lesson plans in music for their pupils. Next slide, please. The thing that I want to share with you here is a passage on the importance of preparing young women to play for family and guests with confidence. Appleton, earlier in her discussion, refers to music as a social science, something that one learns primarily in benefit to others. It's clear that in the Regency, particularly as represented in the many scenes of musical sociability that one finds in Austen's novels, that there is some merit to that argument. The playing of music with and among friends, neighbors, family, is an invaluable part of forming a cohesive social fabric. For Appleton, that makes a solid musical education extremely important in enabling a lady to play a full role in creating social harmony. And here I think we might think about Elizabeth Bennet, who was perhaps not the most, she said herself, not the most talented musician, but her playing and singing really brought joy into their community and was quite important in helping to form that community. And I want to show you a blow up of this interesting little box on the corner, if you could show the next slide, where she provides a useful list of the kinds of things that a young lady ought to learn and practice in turn day by day, so that anytime she was called upon to perform for guests, she would have something ready at hand in order to perform. And it's astonishing to me how extremely close her suggestions are to the contents of the Austen family collection. So all of these composers, even some of the really obscure ones, von Esch and Mazzinghi and Evans, certainly Haydn and J.C. Bach and Cramer and the others, all of them are in the Austen family collections and are highly representative of what the Regency repertoire consisted of in the domestic sphere. And I'm sure that Laura is going to talk more about this next month. So next slide, please. I want to conclude with a few reflections on this wonderful image of musical accomplishment and its limits, because there's every evidence here of a well-supported musicianship. There's a fine square piano by Erard sitting there, an excellent selection of music, encouragement from her family, and yet the young woman is reluctant to play. She's hesitating to play the piano in front of her family, as the title says. She would not have earned the approval of Miss Appleton. In refusing or hesitating to play, she is failing to perform her duty of sociability. And this certainly was one of the primary goals of educating a woman in music. But of course, there were also persuasive voices in the Regency, including Austen herself, arguing that a woman's agency was also important. For every Mary Bennet or Jane Fairfax or Marianne Dashwood willing and eager to perform, there must be a Fanny Price, adamant in her reserve. Whatever musical education a young woman chooses to receive, she must be free to employ it as she will, whether for the enjoyment of others or for her own private pleasure. Final slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow. All right. That was an incredible presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathryn.
Very welcome.
Okay. We're gonna launch into our time for Q&A. We have about 20-25 minutes set aside for that. If you're in the audience, please send in questions. We've received so many already that we'll get to momentarily. But you can post your question in the chat, or you can email us at info@janeaustenandco.org. I have lots of questions, but I want to make sure we start with our question first. So this first one, we had an early question from Lawrence, from Kathryn. Lawrence asks, what was the social role of the guitar in the Regency? Was it appropriate for women to learn and play?
Yes, the guitar was certainly considered to be an appropriate instrument. I think that there were some places where it was popular than others. I see a bit more evidence of its use with amateur musicians in Vienna, for example. There are no Austen characters that play the guitar. There are no guitar pieces in the Austen collection. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist. We know that there were young women playing the guitar in Britain as well, but I think it was not as essential. It was appropriate, but not as essential.
If I may ask a follow-up to that, like, is the guitar, like the pianoforte and the harp, associated with gracefulness? Because it seems like gracefulness is really, really key here to like musical education for women.
Yeah, it could be held in a graceful position, and there are a few portraits, I think, of women holding beautiful guitars. So they were around.
We have a question from Casey Q. It's interesting that the composers seem to be largely male, yet I can't recall any gentlemen in the novels playing piano or any instruments. Any insight on this? Is music composition seen as a trade?
Well, yes. Not only music composition, but music performance. And there's abundant evidence that music performance was considered to be something of a waste of time for a man. It's not generally included in the various instruction manuals that you see. More often in men's instruction manuals, you'll find things about music theory, but not so much about playing. And I think that Austen does not include gentlemen players in her novels. The men who do make music in her novels are the ones who are highly problematic characters,
Like
Mr.
Frank
Willoughby, Frank Churchill. The others, the ones who are true gentlemen, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Knightley, they appreciate music, but they wouldn't be caught dead. Would take it. We include Colonel Brandon in this as well. I think one of the real failings of Emma Thompson's version of Sense and Sensibility was that she turned Brandon into a musician, which he was definitively not, because that would have taken away from the husbanding of the estates and all of the things that a gentleman had to do.
Was it seen as less masculine? Like more would it be more like would it be effeminizing to portray the men as I think the castrati are partly responsible for that. I think there was a real reaction to music as an effeminate pursuit. So thank you.
So here's a good one. What role did the clergy play in composing or influencing the everyday music played in the homes? That is, were there commonly also music tutors, and did homes play and sing a lot of music they wrote?
That's a good question, but I cannot think of a lot of evidence for this. There certainly were clergymen who were musicians, but that tended to be restricted to their activities in the church. They tended not to write music tutors. I can't.
So we don't have Mr. Collins singing at all, do we?
Well, he was another appreciator, and of course he was a gentleman, as he liked to stress, and so I think he would not be sitting down and making music himself.
All right, more audience questions. This is from Jillian Dooley, who was on just a few weeks ago.
Yay.
So some of Austen's manuscripts have figured bass.
Yeah.
Do you think she would have known thorough bass herself?
I think it's possible. I think that the more simple, first inversion chords where you just have a 6 in the bottom, I think that's a possibility. Yeah. I mean, certainly she knew about it. She knew what it was. So
this is maybe a question that doesn't have much grounding, but I'm kind of been developing it since your presentation. This concept of the virtuoso, would that have meant anything to a young Jane Austen? If it wasn't music, did she have aspirations of being a virtuoso in something? I'm just curious.
Well, I think that there's been some good work done on women who became virtuosa. And so I think that there were women who achieved very high levels of musicianship, whether they became professionals or not. And there were women professionals out there. But whether Austen herself had any aspirations in that regard, I would say probably not.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds as though she was a bit modest about her musical accomplishment, even though evidence is that she was pretty good. But the whole business about her playing in the mornings when the rest of the house wasn't up, and things like that.
Yeah.
Could she have thought that thoroughbass was a little ornate?
Mhm.
I don't think thoroughbass really had a reputation for being ornate. I don't think we would have thought about it that way.
So
Maybe she just didn't really have a use for it, except she did play country dances. That's one of the things that she specifically says she wants to have a piano for when they, and I think thoroughbass, as I mentioned earlier, can be useful in turning a kind of skeletal tune into something more full.
Okay. Here's a question from Emily Breitz, who's a student in my global Jane Austen class. What types of songs would girls like Mary Crawford or Mary Bennet play at social functions? Did certain songs signify wealth over others, and were certain more popular?
Yeah, well, I think that the song repertoire was, in a lot of ways, more flexible and less bound to social class than a lot of things. I do think that some of the songs in the Austen music collection that stemmed from Elizabeth Bridges, her sister-in-law, I think she had a sort of more hoity-toity background, and there were Italian operas, arias in there. Things in Italian and French were, obviously a little bit more refined. French romances, Italian arias. But I think people liked all kinds of songs, and these Scotch songs and the Moors Irish melodies and all of those. Everyone sang those. Everyone sang the popular songs from Handel's oratorios that they heard at the benefit concerts in London. Everyone sang Thomas Arne's songs that were also from various stage presentations. So there was a lot of possibilities, and I think that Mary Crawford and Mary Bennet, we know that Mary Crawford had a kind of taste for the finer things, right? So I can see her with her fancy harp playing French romances at the window. Whereas Mary Bennet, I think that she had aspirations, but when it came right down to it, what her sisters asked her to play were Scotch melodies, Scotch songs. So, yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
I do feel, I just wanted to say, I feel like you redeemed Mary Bennet for me somehow. Don't you think? Don't you agree? That, you presented her as somebody that really has the intelligence to do thoroughbass. And why do you think Jane Austen made that such a point of that, giving her that trait?
I think that Austen wants to critique accomplishment in that novel. I think that having Mary Bennet referred to as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood right at the beginning of the novel, and then having her sort of fail at producing pleasure again and again in sort of humiliating circumstances undercuts that notion of what accomplishment is. And we look at Elizabeth Bennet, who we know doesn't play nearly as well as her sister, who doesn't study thoroughbass, who never practices. She produces much more joy with her playing. So I think that Austen is problematizing accomplishment for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is good. From Jim. In The Importance of Being Earnest, Algernon says, I do not play accurately. Anybody can play accurately. I play with feeling. How do you think Jane played? Accurately or with feeling?
I rather suspect that Jane did play accurately. I think that she practiced. I think she was disciplined. And I think she probably played pretty well. But I suspect that she also played with feeling. I think one does not cancel out the other.
Except for Algernon.
I wanted to share Elaine Bander's comments, and I think she remembers you from the 2014.
Yes, Elaine.
Yeah.
She says
Where
that
we
she hadn't
sing
realized-
please.
Oh, please, yes. She said she hadn't realized that Caroline Herschel was as much her brother's partner in music as she was in astronomy. And I was really interested in this connection between astronomy and music. And I think you mentioned it kind of, astronomy is associated with the sublime. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about why these two disciplines are connected, at least in your kind of depiction of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that the idea of a harmony of the spheres, an idea that there was a kind of music as the planets moved across the heavens and as the stars shone and so forth. That's a really ancient way of thinking, and it never really disappears. It's still there in the 18th century. And I think in the case of the Herschels, there was a kind of precision. There's a certain amount of scientific and mathematical method to the study of music, to the theoretical aspects of music, to the internal logic of music systems, which I think is compatible with astronomy. And what you said about the sublime, I think is also important. I think that you can use a musical instrument as a kind of tool in which you examine the inner sublime, right? The inner feeling. You use the telescope as a tool to study the outer sublime. Mm-hmm. And I think that someone who was doing both would have been deeply aware of the compatibility of those two endeavors.
Hmm.
I have a question about the glees. I'm keep thinking about that passage in Mansfield Park where Fanny and Edmund are by the window, and Edmund gets enticed back to the glee,
the earthy,
right?
The earthly as opposed to the sublime.
The earthy lack of harmony over there. Am I misremembering that glees are associated with men's voices and that glee clubs were originally a male thing?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So when he's being enticed over to sing, then?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
He's being enticed to sing, but I strongly suspect that the women of the family were also participating because in the first couple decades of the 19th century, some of these old barriers were already, it's not as though women were being admitted into the men's glees clubs, but they were singing them in the privacy of their homes.
So in what sense were these glee clubs? Were they, what kind of club are we talking about?
Well, they were men's clubs, which would gather men together of a musical bent, and sometimes with a lot of musical skill. There were a number of them in London, quite famous. And you would usually start off with a great big supper and a great deal of drinking, and then begin the glees. And the glee singing could go on until 2 or 3 in the morning. Of course, constantly being refreshed by more swigs from whatever alcohol you were drinking. But that's what the glee club was all about. And
so they didn't perform publicly then. They were just doing
no. There are no women present.
But it spilled out into the public because they held glee writing competitions. And composers would contribute. One of the important composers of glees was John Wall Callcott, and he's well represented in the Austen family collections. So someone in the Austen family was singing glees.
But what are the formal characters? I mean, what is a glee technically? Does it have to have a certain number of
singing? It's part
Okay.
singing. And I think that was part of the joy of it was a really good glee can be rather complicated. You have to be pretty good. A lot of these glee clubs had very limited membership. If someone had to die practically to, for someone else to get in. And you had to be good. You had to be a serious musician in order to, hold up your part. And so it was typically four parts, 5 parts, I think. And they could be very, very colorful. The texts were often very long and involved and narrative. And there was a lot of word painting. In some ways, they're kind of a throwback to the old Renaissance madrigal, only much bawdier and rowdier. And,
So they didn't have a bad reputation in terms of being effeminate the way that other performances of music domestically would have been? Or is this an urban-rural kind of difference?
Well, these were very urban. These were very
Right.
London city.
So maybe that's why it didn't have the negative connotation of being pulled away from your estate duties.
Yeah, this could be seen as, I think that there's kind of a separate sphere in which men had their clubs, and they had their clubs. And yeah, the universities, sure, Cambridge and Oxford had their glee clubs, their supper clubs, which would evolve into glee singing. And, it could be very, very skillful. And it's worth noting that, which song was it? I think one of our famous anthems, not the Star Spangled Banner, but maybe like God Save the King. I think God Save the King started off as a glee, like the Anacreontic Club.
Wow.
Yeah.
So here's a question about one of my favorite pianists of the period is John Field. Would his music have been considered more concert music, or would it have been released for general use? Is he in the?
Yeah, he's a wonderful pianist. I don't recall his music being represented in the Austen family collection. Maybe Jillian could correct me on
Jillian
that.
knew. Yeah.
But Field was popular for a while, but he was kind of limited. He's part of this sort of London school of pianists who played and performed. I think his nocturnes were popular, but not as popular as the other composers.
Yeah.
So we have time for probably 1 or 2 more questions. I had a question about Mary Crawford and that very interesting slide that you shared about the tuning key.
The tuning key.
You said it was suggestive, and I think I know what you mean by suggestive, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate on why is Mary Crawford playing the harp maybe a suggestive narrative choice that Austen makes in Mansfield Park?
Well, one of the things that you notice in illustrations, portraits, whatever, is the angelic associations of the harp, right? And I think that Austen was sort of throwing readers a curve by taking one of the most corrupt characters in any of her novels and making her so angelic. This woman with the harp. And again and again over the course of the novel, we have this reference to her elegance and the charm and all of that. And in the end, of course, it all turns out to be entirely false.
I remember Jeff Nigro once talking about Mary Musgrove's performance of the harp, and he was talking about how very theatrical it can be, and how how body centered it is in a way that the pianoforte isn't, because you're seeing the arms and the in movement.
Yeah. One of the things that I've done a number of times with my students is examine portraits of women and their harps, and there are a lot of them from the last decades of the 18th century. And there's a lot of exposure with the harp. The outline of your leg, because you have to have one leg, you're supporting the harp on your legs, and one leg is forward. You can see your feet on the pedals. And then, of course, the gracefulness of the hands and all of that. So it really is a very embodying kind of instrument, more so than the keyboard, where basically you sit in front of the keyboard and you're quite constrained because of the range of the piano and the place where you have to be and so forth. With the harp, it's very, very different. You're really exposed. And especially in those empire-style dresses. Yeah.
Great.
So here's maybe one last question.
Okay.
From Jane. You talked about this a little, but they're popular folk songs or pop songs.
Well, most of the songs in the Austen family collection are, there wasn't a very clear division at all between popular and classical in that period. Okay. A lot of the tunes from Handel's oratorios were completely popular. Nowadays, they're siloed as classical music. But at that time, in the same collection, you'll have a Handel aria and an Arne tune from a comic vaudeville and a Scotch folk song, all jumbled up together.
Yeah.
And it's all perfectly okay. So this division of pop and classical is really quite new.
That's interesting. And Jillian did say that there's no John Field.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
In the book.
Thank you, Jillian.
Well,
thank
Kathryn,
you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for just a wonderful event. We really appreciate you coming on to Jane Austen and Company.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, if you're still in the audience, please hang around for just a couple minutes. We have a couple more announcements to share. And I'm going to turn things over to Deb now for a few, at least the start of those announcements.
Yeah, so our next event, as mentioned before, will take place on April 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And we will have Laura Klein, and she'll talk on From Air to Arrangement, the evolution of keyboard music in Austen's era. And then, just as a reminder, that tonight's presentation will be posted on the website, a recording of it, janeaustenandco.org. And to YouTube very soon after we finish tonight, it'll be on there. If you can't wait until our next event, you can view any of all the previous programs on that website, which contains the archive of all the lectures, over 40 of them, on topics ranging from Austen's daily musical practice and music books to the work of Regency textile designer Anna Maria Garthwaite to multicultural adaptations of Jane Austen's novels. We've enjoyed bringing you this thought-provoking program for the past 5 years, and we hope it continues.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for attending tonight's presentation. And thank you again, Kathryn, for such a delightful talk. I just have one more announcement, which is if you are interested in attending, or even if you're not interested in attending the Jane Austen Summer Program, you can complete a survey of our new Jane Austen's Desk site, NEH funded, and you can win prizes. We are going to end this contest March 31st, and you can get to this contest by going to the desk at beta.janeaustensdesk.org. And please consider donating if you can. Every little contribution helps us continue to provide new Austen-related content. Have a great night. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.